All right, today we've got a little bit more reading to do. I want to share some things with you. We're coming from Ephesians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, but I'm really going to spend a lot of time reading from Romans chapter 8, verses 9 through 17. So what those are going to be speaking about is how we're tying this into the sermon coming up from Ephesians chapter 1. Listen to what it says in verses 13 and 14 of Ephesians chapter 1. It says, "In him you also were sealed with the promised Holy Spirit, when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and when you believed. The Holy Spirit is the down payment of our inheritance until the redemption of the possession to the praise of His glory." When we're looking at those things, it lays out this hope and this idea of the Holy Spirit really sealing us and marking us as God's chosen one, as God's set-aside vessel. So I want us to read from Romans chapter 8, verses 9 through 17 today. And here's what it says. "You, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you." It's a question where it really calls us to reflect on that. Does the Spirit live in me? Has He changed me? Has He made me new? Is the fruit that comes from my life of the Spirit love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Or is it more indicative of my old way, running after earthly pleasures that ultimately lead to massive regrets and hurt? He goes on and says, "If anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he does not belong to Him. Now, if Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit gives life because of righteousness." It's this interesting picture that the flesh inside of us literally is dying. It's passing away, but it's the Spirit of God who is creating new life in us because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, then He who raised Christ from the dead will also bring your mortal bodies to life through His Spirit who lives in you. So though our bodies are dead to sin, that the resurrection of Christ is literally taking place in our lives and bringing our even physical bodies back to life. So then, brothers and sisters, we are not obligated to the flesh to live according to the flesh. Because if you live according to the flesh, you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all those led by God's Spirit are God's sons. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. Instead, you received the Spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, "Abba, Father." It's like their version of saying, "Daddy, my daddy." The Spirit Himself testifies together with our spirit that we are God's children, and if children, also heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. It seems a blessing far too extravagant to even begin to imagine. He goes on and says, "If we suffer with Him, so that we may also be glorified with Him." It lays out this idea that the old literally is dying, and that the life we now live, we live by the resurrection power of Jesus Christ. It gives us new hope. It indicates that we're no longer obligated to the sins of the past or the habits of the past, but that we're set free to live in Him and for His glory and His goodness. It seems amazing, but I want to remind you of what we studied in Galatians chapter 4. Verses 6 and 7, it says this, "Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father,'" Daddy, our Daddy. "So you are no longer a slave, but a son. If a son, then God has made you an heir." Why on earth would we live the way we used to when we have God who's given us such extravagant blessings. Go and live today as His heir, as the one who carries hope in His name, who is the very representative of who He is.